It's the 19th century and Britannia rules the waves. The British Empire is so large that it's said the sun never sets upon it, eventually covering a quarter of our planet's landmass. It was simply the biggest empire that the world had ever seen. And the reason it was able to grow so large was through the strength of its colonial ambitions. And that was enforced by the iron fist of the empire, the Royal Navy. Britain's systems of organisation, trade and warfare were light years ahead of everybody else during its heyday, and managing the Navy was akin to managing the empire itself. From hunting pirates on trade routes to fighting wars with other empires to subjugating the natives of faraway lands to extract their resources, the Royal Navy was the invincible titan of its era. So, how do you run a tight ship? For an operation so large, you have to have a strict hierarchy and rules to keep things efficient. And if someone were to break those rules, well, then it would be time for punishment. And they could range from the not so bad all the way to the downright horrific, even fatal. This is the story of the worst punishments in the Royal Navy. So, as we mentioned, these punishments can range from the 19th century version of a slap on the wrist all the way up to literal death. But why were some of these punishments so harsh, even for such small infractions? Why would the Navy want to kill their sailors? Well, that comes down to the needs of the Navy itself and the needs of the Empire at the time. Royal Navy historians point out that during the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, which took place from 1793 to 1815, different forms of punishment seem to have grown more severe in a British fleet that was getting bigger. And this makes sense. For one, the Navy was ever expanding, and having more and more people working within it led to greater risks. Mutinies were not uncommon in the Royal Navy, as many sailors within it weren't always there by choice, being press-ganged into service elsewhere and having their wages deferred for a long time so that they couldn't quit. A navy of such gargantuan size needed to be run effectively. Sailors had to know their roles, especially when on the precipice of war. There were no courts out on open water, so the captain was left as the judge. Harsh punishments were therefore a factor of circumstance, but also a direct tactic by the Royal Navy to keep sailors in line. Okay, but let's suppose that you're a sailor and you did something wrong, nothing crazy, just a minor slip-up. Perhaps you were found tipsy on grog mid-shift. So what would happen to you? Well, you'd likely be subjected to the first of our punishments, bread and water. Yep, back in the day, Royal Navy sailors couldn't simply sail the seas sloshed, and for minor issues like drunkenness or even being late to come back from shore leave, you could be threatened with bread and water. Now, that doesn't tend to sound like such a terrible thing, especially when compared to the blood and guts punishments that we'll get into later. With bread and water, not a single drop of sanguine is spilled. And you even get fed in a time where most places would just starve you to death, so this doesn't seem to be a punishment at all, does it? But trust us, it seriously was. Remember, the Navy only used punishments it found effective because it was critical to the safe and orderly running of the maritime fleet. If they used bread and water as a punishment, it's because it worked. So, what actually was it? Well, instead of just a dietary restriction, it's actually a very nasty form of confinement. Now, for very small infractions, sometimes you would be thrown in the brig, a small cell in the ship's lower decks, to serve your punishment, and typically you would be fed regular rations, as the Navy didn't want you to die for something so small. They need the manpower after all, that's why you're at sea. But if your act of hijinks irritates the captain just enough, they might decide you don't deserve that luxury, meaning the only things you'll be able to consume are bread and water whilst all locked up. This is a miserable experience. You're in a dark, cramped cell all day, every day, for 3 days straight. Your only reprieve is the sorry excuse for bread they had during the era. You see, bread on ships would often grow mouldy because of the moisture present all around you when at sea. But soon maritime travellers realised that mixing flour and salt with as little water as possible gets you a substance called hardtack. It's also called a ship's biscuit. This stuff was hard as a rock, literally, and was genuinely very difficult to eat by itself. You could soak it in a liquid to soften it up some, but that could waste your water. Often, people would simply have to let the tack go stale and soft first, in which case it was usually musty, mouldy, and infested with insects like maggots. To make matters worse, the so-called fresh water on a ship was actually pretty foul. It was kept in wooden casks, which meant it would quickly turn stagnant and even have algae in it. That kind of water was almost guaranteed to make you sick, and it's part of the reason why the British Navy preferred a daily ration of grog, which was basically just watered-down rum. The rum helped with the taste and likely some of the bacteria too, rendering it safer to drink. But if you're on bread and water, you don't have this benefit. Throw in the lack of entertainment, no social interaction, and the humiliation from being imprisoned, and this punishment wasn't overly physically taxing, but mentally it would have had a major effect. It sucks just enough for a person to not want to be late or drunk ever again. Many naval punishments were carried out formally, designed to appear as justice rather than mere retribution. The warrant for a sailor's arrest would be read on the quarterdeck, and the prisoner would be sentenced under the Articles of War, which was just a fancy title for British naval law at the time. More severe crimes required a court-martial, and in that case, the prisoner was to be taken back to the homeland and tried. But this formality actually led to some surprisingly modern human rights standards from the British Navy that was well ahead of its time. When a prisoner was confined, such as when serving the bread and water punishment, they would have monitoring and welfare checks. A prisoner in solitary, according to the Queen's Regulation and Admiralty Instructions of 1861, had to be visited every 4 hours by the police, or in this case, one of the ship's corporals or the master-at-arms. This was to make sure that the confinement was lawful and check on the prisoner for any complications. Moreover, because the water could make you sick, a medical officer would check the prisoner once per day for any health issues. Even the cells had to meet minimum standards, being at least 6.5 feet long, at least 3 feet across, and even had to be well ventilated. It's interesting to see this phenomenon take place under the British when in India they were strapping men to cannons and blasting them to smithereens at the same time. I did a video on that, by the way, and watch it after this one. It's grisly. But interestingly enough, back to bread and water, it was eventually outlawed as a punishment in 1891 by the Royal Navy, but the practice lived on in the US Navy, which retained the punishment until 2019. Okay, but what if you did something worse than just drunkenness and the captain's really mad at you? What punishment might you get then? Well, in that case, you could well end up having to run the gauntlet. Running the gauntlet was a very interesting punishment, not only because it was a more interactive form of discipline for the crew, but the crew could decide how harsh to be. In this method, a person would be made to run in a circular motion around the ship's main deck and would often have to do so several times. During this circuit, the accused would pass between two lines of shipmates, one on either side, who would beat them with modified versions of the infamous cat of nine tails, as well as other objects. This was a punishment in a few ways. For one, it could be potentially very painful to get hit in the face or other more sensitive areas, and it wasn't necessarily a case of sprinting through it either. Some Royal Navy ships were large, and doing several laps of one would mean that the accused would eventually slow down a bit, prolonging the punishment. It was also something of a humiliation ritual. Any of your crewmates who you irritated before this punishment now finally had a chance to get their own back on you, and there's nothing you can do about it. You simply have to run and take it, often to the sound of rapturous laughter from the crew enjoying your discomfort. So, what would lead to such a painful punishment? Well, it didn't take much. Not returning from leave in time was a common one. This might be because it could have been seen as disrespectful to the other sailors who arrived back on time, now being held up by someone else's tardiness. Another one would be keeping your quarters unclean. Remember, you had to live with the people around you in the Navy, and as well as just not being very sailor-like, being dirty, again, made a mockery of those who did keep their quarters neat and orderly. So if you'd sufficiently irritated the crew through such inaction, you could find yourself subjected to a pretty nasty walloping. However, the crew could also like you, and if they did, or if they didn't fully agree with the punishment, they'd go easier on you. They would actively try not to cause you physical injury. Take Francis Lanyon, for example, a seaman aboard the guard ship HMS Royal George, who in 1760 was sentenced to 3 runs of the gauntlet for failing to return from leave. The crew clearly disagreed with the punishment, and the ship's lieutenant later recorded that Lanyon received no substantial injury from the process. So the crew did have an important say in how bad your punishment was. This had its benefits, right? It strengthened camaraderie and enforced order among the troops. However, this agency for the crew could sometimes undermine the captain's authority. So, occasionally, some particularly naughty prisoners would get a dozen lashes ordered by the captain beforehand to make any blows whilst running the gauntlet hurt even more. But in the end, the Navy stopped agreeing with the punishment altogether, whether it was the sense of unity that the crew felt in opposition to a captain's orders, or another perhaps more humanitarian factor. It was nonetheless abolished as a punishment in the Royal Navy all the way back in 1806. More formal and less collective punishments were the focus from this point onwards. Other sailors would still participate, but not in a way that could influence the outcome. Let's imagine, though, that you did something even worse than having untidy quarters. The captain is downright furious, and you're going to be punished severely. What would happen? Well, it gets a lot worse. Those get lashes. Now, lashes, or floggings, were serious punishment, and they could be doled out by the captain for almost anything, but they were usually reserved for very poor behaviour. Floggings could be dished out for all manner of crimes, though, including some of the ones we've mentioned so far: drunkenness, mutiny, neglect of duty, assault, desertion, going AWOL, disobedience, insolence, theft, quarrelling, fighting, riotous behaviour, embezzlement, and get this, for chewing too loudly. Okay, the last one we made up. But the others are real crimes that the captain could dish out a flogging for. And what's the difference between drunkenness that gets you bread and water and drunkenness that gets you lashes? It's likely up to the captain's interpretation of the crime, assessing its seriousness when considering punishment in context. It could also be a result of repeat offences too. Despite the risks, though, some just couldn't help themselves. Take the HMS Daphne, for example. Between 1776 and 1783, 99 floggings were handed out on her deck. Drunken behaviour led to 33 of them, a perfect third. The only one to get more would be neglect of duty, such as sleeping when you're supposed to be on watch, for example. The average number of lashes on the Daphne was between 10 and 20, depending on the severity of the punishment, but it could go much higher, even into the hundreds. So, enough beating around the bush. What actually happens when a sailor got lashed? Well, they would be stripped to the waist and then tied to something on the ship, perhaps a mast or a grate with their back exposed. The crime would be worth a certain number of lashes, of which would be administered by the captain or other members of the crew. Captains sometimes did this to enforce discipline amongst the sailors, giving them an up-and-close, personal look at what will happen if they did the same thing. The lashes could be given with many things like rods, wooden canes, or other objects, but the one that saw the most use was the infamous cat o' nine tails. Rods and canes could, let's remember, break bones or cause internal injuries, not good for when you need a functional crewmate, but the cat of nine tails was just sheer pain. It was a wooden stick with 9 pieces of string or thin rope coming out from it, like a medieval flogger. Then they'd be knotted at various intervals along the rope, which would make them extra painful when they struck you. Men would be slashed with this across their back at full force for the appropriate number of lashes. In particularly grim accounts, the accused sailor had to make his own whip within 24 hours to be beaten with, which was as humiliating as it was painful. One blow, by the way, from the cat was enough to draw blood and rip skin from flesh, so even a dozen of them would be considered agonising, leaving the accused black and blue and scarred for a long time afterwards. Fun fact, this is actually where the phrase "not enough room to swing a cat" comes from. I'm sure many of you have been imagining flinging felines whenever you heard that in the past, but it's actually to do with the cat of nine tails. Anyway, as mentioned, sometimes the captain would get the crew involved, which prolonged the punishment. They particularly liked left-handed crewmen for this, because their own slashes would cut right across the ones made by right-handed crew, causing even more misery for the accused. In 1831, Private Alexander Somerville of the Royal Scots Greys was flogged with the cat after writing to a newspaper at the height of the agitation for parliamentary reform. He had this to say about the experience: "I felt an astounding sensation between the shoulders under my neck, which went to my toenails in one direction, my fingernails in another, and stung me to the heart, as if a knife had gone through my body." Some captains were particularly harsh, like Captain Hugh Pigot of the HMS Success. During a 9-month period, he ordered at least 85 floggings, the equivalent of half the crew. Subsequently, 2 of these men died from their injuries. Yes, floggings can be fatal, especially if lashes are administered in the hundreds. It gets even worse, though. A common punishment for more serious offences was known as flogging around the fleet, in which a sailor would be transported from ship to ship, getting a certain number of lashes from a crew member on it. This was particularly humiliating, as the punishment was not just left exclusive to the ship a sailor was on, instead being viewed by every ship in the near vicinity. Eventually, the lashing would end and the sailor would be let free, often bruised and bleeding. Afterwards, salt would then be rubbed into the wounds, although it's reported that this was to stop infections more than it was to cause any more pain. That was just an unfortunate feature. In the end, flogging would also be left behind after being abolished in 1881, and it's for the best, really. But all of that leads us to one question. What could be worse than that? And this was remarkably simple. All you need was a rope. Now, you might have expected me to bring up keel hauling for the final punishment, but this was actually more of a form of punishment in the Dutch Navy, not the British Royal Navy. Some sources allude to it being used, and I don't doubt that it may have on occasion, but it was never a formal punishment, and the sources on it are a bit murky. Not to mention, I've already done a video on keel hauling where we go into all of it in some gruesome detail. But I won't be retreading old ground today for an edge case, so we're going to talk about the worst punishment for crewmen: hanging. There's not much to say about hanging that hasn't already been said. Ever since human beings were first capable of twisting fibres into rope, people have been hanging each other. In the Royal Navy, at the height of the British Empire, it was the formal execution method that came after serious mutinies or other capital crimes like murder. And everyone was sure to see it when it happened. A mutineer would be led in irons onto the main deck of the ship, where their crewmates gathered in a crowd. They would have been shackled under the arms or at the waist, ensuring that they wouldn't be able to get themselves free. The rope was then thrown over the yardam. On an old ship, this is referring to the widest horizontal mast that extends over the side of the ship. Once retrieved, a noose would be tied around the perpetrator's neck. They would be given a chance to say any last words before being slowly hoisted up by the neck over the side of the ship. They would then be left hanging as they slowly asphyxiated to death, kicking and twitching as they struggled for breath, and then they would go limp, with their corpse swinging as a clear deterrent for all to see. The deterrent would usually be left up for at least several hours, far longer than is actually needed to suffocate someone to death. But in some cases, the corpses were left hanging on the yardam for days, with them only being taken down when they started to decay in the salty sea breeze. Sometimes there would be multiple bodies hanging there at once. The Nore Mutiny in 1797 was one such example. After a mutiny that started out the sailors' economic grievances was brutally put down, 29 men were hanged from the yardams of various ships in the fleet. Admiral John Jervis, later the first Earl of St. Vincent, turned to an officer beside him, watching one mutineer hanging from the yardam, and said, "Discipline is preserved, sir." When these ships were sailing together, they must have appeared like an arbiter of death as they creeped over the horizon, striking fear into the heart of any pirates nearby. Nobody would dare defy the crown after seeing that. The last man to be hanged by the Royal Navy was Private John Gallagher in 1860 after stealing some brandy and shooting 2 officers aboard the HMS Leven. The practice of public hanging was actually abolished 8 years later in 1868. I'm struck at how much more solemn hanging seems in relation to the other punishments we've talked about. The others appear almost bombastic, like a spectacle to be gawked at, but the stories of sailors hanging and simply being left there like a common criminal is truly the most chilling. I'm also struck at how different the punishments doled out by the Royal Navy were. They were all designed to serve a slightly different purpose, one for discomfort, one for public humiliation, one for pain, and one for death. Now, there's definitely overlap between those 4 categories, but it's interesting to see how each one seems primarily intended for a specific purpose. They do have their similarities, of course, with pain and humiliation being the main avenues towards correcting behaviour. The punishment system was also a feature of its time, let's not forget. You'll notice that all 4 of the punishment methods were abolished in the Royal Navy before the turn of the 20th century. And that spoke to how the Navy was changing. A shift to a voluntary enlistment system meant that ships no longer had to be run through sheer deterrence. Britain, as it started to consider more humanitarian goals, although this was quite a selective process, the Crown also understood that the Navy was the face of the Empire. It's what many people who would learn about Britain would see first, and bodies hanging from masts just didn't seem to send the right message anymore. The ideas around discipline changed too, favouring loss of pay or grog, or even prison sentences in dedicated military prisons over blood and guts, pain and suffering. And so in a funny way, these punishments tell us an interesting story about the British Empire and its evolution as a whole. How over time, these punishments, while somewhat effective, were phased out. But as the level of professionalism increased, Britain's empire grew larger and larger without the need for such spectacles. And it would be this change that would eventually turn Britain from another global power to the unrivaled hegemon of the planet and the largest empire of all time.